Christmas night, I did not lose my family because I realized I never truly had one. A single sentence spoken before everyone severed the illusions I had maintained for 34 years. They thought I would crumble, but nobody expected that I had been preparing for that exact moment longer than they could imagine. When the truth finally surfaced, the control they loved so much was gone forever. My name is Marianne Holloway. I am 34 years old, and I have lived in the shadow of Redwood Falls for my entire life. The snow outside the windows of the Holloway estate was falling with a relentless, heavy silence, burying the driveway in white. But inside, the air was suffocatingly warm. It smelled of roasting duck, expensive pine candles, and the specific, metallic scent of old money. The dining room was staged like a battlefield disguised as a celebration. The mahogany table was extended to its full length to accommodate 20 guests, draped in linens that cost more than my first car. Crystal glasses caught the light from the chandelier, fracturing it into tiny, blinding rainbows across the plates. My mother had arranged the seating cards with the precision of a general planning a siege. Every year the layout changed slightly, but the hierarchy remained absolute. At the head of the table sat my father, Richard Holloway. He did not just sit, he presided. He was 60 years old, but he carried himself with the aggressive vitality of a man who refused to acknowledge the concept of aging. He was currently holding court, recounting a story about a hostile takeover he had orchestrated in the late 90s. His voice boomed, demanding attention without ever explicitly asking for it. "You see, the market is like a shark," Richard said, gesturing with a heavy crystal tumbler of scotch. "It doesn't care if you are nice. It cares if you bleed." I told them, "If you show fear, you are already dead." The guests laughed. They always laughed. It was a practiced, synchronized sound that rattled the silverware. I sat at the far end of the table, squeezed between a decorative marble bust and the sharp elbow of a distant cousin who had not looked at me once since the appetizers were served. My brother, Lucas, sat on Richard's right. That was the seat of power. My seat was an afterthought, a space filled simply to ensure the table looked symmetrical. I was part of the set dressing, less important than the centerpiece of imported winter orchids. I reached for the water pitcher, my hand brushing against the sleeve of the man next to me. "Excuse me," I murmured. He did not turn. He was too busy nodding at my father, his eyes wide with performed fascination. "Marianne, move your glass," my mother called out from across the table. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the low hum of conversation. She was not looking at my face. She was looking at the tablecloth. "You are going to stain the linen." I moved my glass 3 inches to the right. I did not argue. I did not sigh. 10 years ago, this invisible wall between me and my family would have made me shrink into my chair. I used to spend these dinners analyzing my own behavior, dissecting every breath I took, wondering what joke I had missed or what outfit I had worn that was too dull. I used to think the silence around me was a punishment for some unknown crime I had committed simply by being born female and quiet in a house that valued noise and dominance. But tonight felt different. The dull, familiar ache in my chest was gone. It had been replaced by a cold, hard clarity that settled in my stomach like a stone. Richard paused his story to pour more wine. He looked down the length of the table, his gaze sliding over me like I was a smudge on a window pane. "Lucas just closed the deal on the waterfront project," Richard announced, his face flushing with pride. $20 million. That is how you build a legacy. That is Holloway blood. I cleared my throat. The sound was small, but in the brief lull, it was audible. "Actually," I started, keeping my voice level and calm. "I wanted to share that I was promoted to senior analyst at Northvale Strategies. I am managing the entire Eastern Division now." Richard did not blink. He kept looking at Lucas. "A toast to Lucas," he said, raising his glass high. "To the future of this family." My words hung in the air, unacknowledged and dying a quick, humiliating death. The cousin next to me bumped my arm as he raised his glass, spilling a drop of red wine on my wrist. I watched the red liquid bead on my skin like fresh blood. To Lucas, the table chorused. I did not raise my glass. I wiped the wine from my wrist with a napkin, moving with slow, deliberate motions. I looked at my father. He was glowing with the arrogance of a man who believes he owns everything he sees. He thought he owned the narrative. He thought my silence was submission. He had no idea what was sitting in the sleek black purse resting against my ankle under the table. Inside that bag was a smartphone loaded with 5 years of archived emails. It held bank statements that contradicted his public tax filings. It held the digital trail of shell companies used to funnel money from the very project he was currently toasting. I took a slow sip of water. The ice was cold against my teeth. They were celebrating a kingdom built on rot, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to shore up the foundation. I was just waiting for the right moment to let gravity take over. "Marianne," my father said suddenly, his eyes finally locking onto mine with a look of mild irritation, as if my lack of enthusiasm was a personal insult. "Stop looking so dour. It's Christmas." "Smile for the room." I looked him dead in the eye. "I am smiling, Dad," I said softly. He turned away, satisfied with what he thought was obedience. He did not see that my smile did not reach my eyes. He did not know that I had walked into this house tonight, knowing I would never walk back in again. The appetizers were cleared away by the silent catering staff, replaced by bowls of lobster bisque that smelled of cream and sherry. I stared at the pale pink surface of the soup and felt the familiar sensation of time warping, pulling me back to a different dining room. 20 years ago. The furniture had been different then, but the dynamic was identical. I was 14 years old. I had just won the state mathematics championship, a feat that had required 3 months of sleepless nights and relentless study. I had placed the heavy gold trophy on the center of the kitchen island, naive enough to believe it would act as a magnet for their affection. When Richard walked in, he glanced at it, then looked at my brother, Lucas, who was 12 at the time and currently failing pre-algebra. "See this," Lucas Richard had said, resting a heavy hand on my brother's shoulder. "Marianne is good at the technical stuff. That is fine for a worker. But you have the personality. You are a leader. You will hire people like Marianne one day." He had turned my victory into a lesson on my brother's future supremacy before he had even taken off his coat. That was the pattern. My achievements were either invisible or recontextualized as service to the family name, while Lucas's failures were framed as charming eccentricities. When Lucas was 16, he crashed Richard's vintage Jaguar into a neighbor's fence. I was the one who drove him home before the police arrived. I was the one who called the tow truck. Yet, the next morning, my mother looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. "Marianne," she had sighed, her voice trembling with that practiced fragility. "Why did you let him take the keys? You know he gets excited. You need to be the responsible one. Don't make things difficult for your father. Don't make things difficult." That phrase was the anthem of my childhood. It was etched into my bones. It meant disappear. It meant absorb the shock so the men don't have to feel it. I never argued back then. I didn't scream. I didn't throw things. That was the insidious nature of the Holloway household. There were no bruises, no locked closets, no drunken rages. It was cleaner than that, and infinitely more damaging. They did not break my body. They simply refused to acknowledge that I occupied space as an independent entity. To them, I was a supporting character in the movie of their lives. And supporting characters do not get to have needs. The only person who saw me was Aunt Evelyn. She was my father's older sister, a woman who had been estranged from the family business for 30 years. She died when I was 22, but I still remember the smell of her menthol cigarettes and the dry, papery feel of her hand on my arm during one of these suffocating Christmas dinners. "Stop trying to win, Marianne," she had whispered to me while Richard was loudly recounting a golf game. "You can't win a game where the rules change every time you roll the dice. Just watch. Watch them like you are watching a nature documentary. And keep receipts." Receipts I had asked. "Proof," she hissed, smoke curling from her lips. "Memory is a liar. Write it down. One day, the truth will be the only weapon you have left. I took her advice. I stopped crying in my bedroom and started observing. I became a historian of my own erasure. When Richard claimed he had funded my college tuition, I saved the bank statements showing I had paid every cent through scholarships and 2 part-time jobs. When Lucas claimed credit for a business strategy I had outlined for him over email, I archived the thread. I looked across the table at Lucas now. He was 32, handsome in a soft, unearned way, laughing too loudly at a joke Richard had just made. He looked happy. Why wouldn't he be? He lived in a world where consequences were things that happened to other people. I realized then that love in this house was not an emotion. It was a transaction. It was a currency. But it was a fiat currency with no backing. You could buy their approval, but the price was your soul, and the exchange rate was rigged. Marianne. My mother's voice snapped me back to the present. You haven't touched your soup. Is something wrong with it? I picked up my spoon. The silver felt heavy and cold. No, Mother, I said. It is perfect. Just like everything else tonight. Good, she said, turning away immediately. We don't want to seem ungrateful to the chef. I dipped the spoon into the bisque. I wasn't ungrateful. In fact, I was filled with a profound sense of gratitude. I was grateful that they had taught me exactly who they were. I was grateful that they had shown me that loyalty was a one-way street. Because if they had been even a fraction kinder, even 10% more loving, I might have hesitated about what I was going to do next. But they had made it easy. They had starved me of affection for so long that I no longer felt the hunger. I only felt the cold, clinical precision of the executioner. Northvale Strategies is not the kind of place where you survive on nepotism. It is a fortress of glass and steel in downtown Boston, where the only currency that matters is data. I started there as a junior associate, working 80 hours a week, surviving on vending machine coffee and sheer adrenaline. I did not get the job because of Richard Holloway. In fact, on my application, I had listed my mother's maiden name as my middle name to distance myself from his reputation. Every promotion, every raise, and every client acquisition was the result of my own sweat and my own sleepless nights. Yet, to hear my family tell it, my corner office was a gift Richard had graciously bestowed upon me. I remember a cocktail party last year where Richard introduced me to a potential investor. He had wrapped an arm around my shoulder, his grip tight enough to bruise. This is Marianne. He had beamed, flashing his veneers. She runs the analytics division over at Northvale. I had to pull a few strings to get her in the door. You know how it is? But she is doing well. We raised her to understand the value of hard work. I had stood there, frozen in my heels, smiling a plastic smile while rage boiled in my gut. I wanted to scream that he had never met my boss. I wanted to tell the investor that Richard didn't even know what my job title actually meant, but I didn't. I just nodded. Thank you, Dad. I had said. That was the lie I told myself every day, that keeping the peace was worth the price of my dignity. But back at my desk, I was building a different kind of portfolio. Every time Richard sent me an email asking for a quick look at a contract, I saved it to an encrypted drive. Every time Lucas texted me asking for insider thoughts on a market trend, I archived the screenshot. I wasn't just working, I was compiling a dossier. It was Julian, the vice president of risk management and the only person at Northvale I considered a friend, who finally snapped me out of my passivity. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks before Christmas. Julian walked into my office and closed the door behind him. He didn't sit down. He tossed a glossy prospectus onto my desk. Marianne, have you seen this? He asked, his voice low and serious. I looked at the cover. It was a pitch deck for a new venture capital fund being launched by Lucas. No, I said, picking it up. Why would I turn to page 12? Julian said. I flipped the page. There, under the heading Board of Advisors, was my name. Beside it was my full title at Northvale Strategies and a bio that implied I was personally overseeing the fund's risk assessment. My blood ran cold. I had never agreed to this. I hadn't even seen this document before. He is trading on your reputation. Marianne, Julian said, leaning his hands on my desk, this fund is high-risk garbage. If this goes south, and it will, the SEC isn't going to look for Lucas. They are going to look for the certified financial analyst listed as the advisor. They are going to look for you. I stared at the paper. The photo they used was taken from my LinkedIn profile. I didn't know, I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. I know you didn't, Julian said, his expression softening slightly. But the market doesn't care about what you know. It cares about what you signed, or what people think you signed. You need to kill this, Marianne. If you don't stop them, you are not a victim anymore. You are an accomplice. His words hit me like a physical blow. An accomplice. I had spent my whole life thinking that my silence was a shield, a way to protect myself from their drama. I thought that by not engaging, I was taking the high road. But looking at that prospectus, seeing my hard-earned professional identity being strip-mined to prop up my brother's mediocrity, I realized I was wrong. My silence wasn't protection, it was permission. I looked up at Julian. My hands were shaking, but I forced them to be still. Can I keep this copy? I asked. Take it, Julian said. But Marianne, whatever you are planning to do, make sure you don't miss. Because people like your father, they don't play fair. I placed the prospectus into my bag, right next to the encrypted hard drive. I know, I said, feeling a strange, dark calm settle over me. I am done playing fair. I am just going to play to win. That was the moment the scale tipped. I realized that walking away wasn't enough. Merely quitting the family wasn't enough. I had to dismantle the lie before it destroyed everything I had built. I looked at the calendar on my wall. Christmas was 21 days away. It was enough time. It was exactly enough time to prepare the end of the world. The main course had been cleared, leaving only the heavy silence of digestion and the sharp clink of Richard's spoon against his dessert glass. He stood up again. He loved the sound of his own voice more than he loved the vintage port he was currently swirling in his hand. Attention. Everyone, Richard commanded. The room fell silent instantly. I want to circle back to what I said earlier. This new fund Lucas is launching, it is not just a business. It is a declaration. We are looking at a projected return of 30% in the first quarter alone. A murmur of appreciation rippled through the guests. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap. 30% was a fantasy. It was a Ponzi scheme number, not a projection. Marianne, a voice called out from across the table. It was Arthur Sterling, an old business partner of my father's, who had always treated me with a distant but genuine kindness. You work in risk analysis. What is your take on the market volatility for a venture like this? I opened my mouth to speak. Well, Mr. Sterling, the current indicators suggest Marianne thinks the sky is falling every time it rains. Richard cut in, his voice booming over mine. He didn't even look at me. He just smiled at Arthur. That is why she stays in the back office. She is good at counting. We leave the vision to the men in the room. Right. A few uncomfortable chuckles floated up from the table. Lucas smirked, swirling his wine. She worries too much, Lucas added, dismissing me with a wave of his hand. I told her, Marianne, you need to think big. But she likes her spreadsheets. I closed my mouth. I picked up my water glass. The water was room temperature now. Actually, Arthur persisted, his brow furrowing slightly. I saw Marianne's name on the advisory board list in the prospectus you sent over. Richard, if she is advising, I assume she has vetted the risk. The air in the room shifted. It became thinner, sharper. This was the moment. Richard had used my name to sell his lie, and now he had to publicly claim it. Of course, Richard lied effortlessly. She is involved, strictly in a supportive capacity. We threw her a bone to help build her resume. You know how it is. Family helps family, charity. He was calling my stolen professional identity charity. I heard she was doing quite well on her own, Arthur said, his eyes flicking to me. Senior analyst is a serious title. Richard laughed. It was a harsh, barking sound. Titles are free, Arthur, Richard said, leaning forward, his face flushed with wine and arrogance. Marianne is a worker bee, and honestly, it is for the best. If she spent half as much time looking for a husband as she does staring at computer screens, maybe I would have grandchildren by now instead of just quarterly reports. The joke landed with a wet thud. It was ugly. It was unnecessary. It stripped away the pretense of professional respect and reduced me to a failing womb. The table went dead silent. The woman to my left, a socialite named Mrs. Vanderbilt, looked down at her plate, suddenly fascinated by the cheesecake. Dad, Lucas mumbled, looking slightly embarrassed, but not enough to defend me. Come on. What Richard spread his hands wide, playing the victim of his own cruelty. I am just saying, a woman of 34. The clock is ticking, Marianne. We are just worried about your happiness. I looked at him. I did not blush. I did not look down. My heart rate had actually slowed down. It was a physiological phenomenon I had read about the calm before a predator strikes. I saw Arthur Sterling looking at me. He wasn't laughing. He was studying my face, his eyes narrowing. He saw something the others missed. He saw that I wasn't hurt. He saw that I was calculating. Marian Arthur asked softly, "Are you all right?" I turned my gaze to my father. He was grinning, waiting for me to snap, waiting for me to run out of the room in tears so he could sigh and tell everyone how unstable I was. He wanted a reaction. I gave him one. I smiled. It was the coldest thing I had ever done. I am perfectly fine. Dad, I said, my voice steady and clear, cutting through the tension like a scalpel. You are absolutely right. The clock is ticking. Richard's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He didn't understand the context, but he felt the threat vibration in the air. He blinked, unsure of why the hairs on the back of his neck were suddenly standing up. I checked the time on my phone under the table. It was 8:45 in the evening. The automated email blast I had scheduled was set to go out at 9 o'clock. 15 minutes. That was all the time he had left as the patriarch of this family. I took a sip of my wine and tasted iron. Richard did not like being challenged, even obliquely. He refilled his glass with a motion that was too sharp, sending a splash of dark red wine onto the pristine white tablecloth. It spread like a fresh wound, but no one dared to point it out. He set the bottle down with a heavy thud that rattled the silverware. You know what the problem with this generation is? Richard asked, addressing the room, but keeping his eyes fixed on me. Ingratitude. We live in a world where children take, and when asked for a simple return on investment, a little respect, a little loyalty, they act as if they are being oppressed. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, my posture perfect. I was not eating. I was barely breathing. I was simply observing the mechanics of his rage. It was fascinating, in a clinical way, to watch how he constructed a reality where he was the victim. This family needs people who are grateful. Richard continued, his voice gaining that dangerous, gravelly texture that usually preceded an explosion. We need builders, not weights, not people who drag us down with their emotional baggage and their mediocrity. He was talking about me. He was implying that I was a financial and emotional drain on the Holloway empire. The irony was so thick I could almost taste it. I had paid off my own student loans. I paid the mortgage on my apartment in the city. I paid for my own car, my own insurance, and the dress I was currently wearing. Richard had not written a check for me in 12 years. Yet, in his mind, my very existence was a debt I could never repay. I looked at Lucas. My brother was staring intently at the stem of his wine glass, twirling it between his thumb and forefinger. He knew the truth. He knew I had loaned him $5,000 last month to cover a gambling debt he didn't want his wife to know about. He knew I was the one who fixed his spreadsheets before board meetings so he wouldn't look incompetent. Lucas, I said, my voice soft but carrying across the table. Do you think I'm a burden? Lucas froze. He looked up, his eyes darting between me and our father. He looked like a trapped animal. Well, Marianne. You know how Dad gets. Lucas stammered, his voice weak. Just don't provoke him. He looked back down. That was his choice. In that silence, Lucas signed his name to the betrayal. He was not just a bystander. He was a beneficiary of my degradation. If I was the failure, he remained the success. If I was the villain, he remained the hero. I thought back to every time I had been asked to step aside, the time I was told not to apply to Harvard because it would overshadow Lucas's acceptance to a state school, the time I was told to wear a plain dress to my cousin's wedding so I wouldn't draw attention. I had spent 34 years making myself smaller so the men in this family could feel big. But tonight, I was done shrinking. I am not provoking anyone, I said calmly. I am listening. Dad says he wants gratitude. I am just wondering what exactly I should be grateful for. Richard's face turned a deep, blotchy shade of purple. He was not used to this. He was used to tears. He was used to apologies. My lack of emotion was short-circuiting his control. You should be grateful you have a seat at this table, Richard shouted, abandoning all pretense of civil dinner conversation. Spittle flew from his mouth. You should be grateful I let you carry the Holloway name without me. You are nothing. You are a clerk, a nobody. You think because you have a little job, you are independent. You are only there because people know who your father is. The guests were staring at their plates, terrified. The air in the room was so tense it felt like it could snap a bone. Is that so? I asked. I picked up my napkin and dabbed the corner of my mouth. Yes. That is so. Richard slammed his hand on the table. You look at me with that arrogant look on your face. You think you are better than us. You think you are untouchable, I think, I said, checking my watch again, that you are confusing fear with respect. And I think you are about to find out that I ran out of fear a long time ago. Richard stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. He leaned over the table, looming towards me. He wanted to intimidate me. He wanted me to flinch. I did not flinch. I looked at him with the same expression one might use when looking at a child throwing a tantrum in a supermarket. You are pushing me, Marianne, Richard hissed, his voice dropping to a low, menacing register. You are pushing me to do something we will both regret. No, Dad, I said. Only one of us is going to regret this. The room held its breath. The silence was absolute. Everyone knew that the next word spoken would shatter the family forever. I waited. I wanted him to say it. I needed him to say it. It was the final key needed to unlock the nuclear option I had buried in my purse. Richard looked at me with a mixture of disgust and triumphant finality. He believed he was holding the ultimate trump card. In his world, access to him was the sun around which all of our lives orbited. To be cast out of that orbit was to freeze to death. He straightened his tie, a gesture of regaining composure, and delivered the verdict he had likely been rehearsing in his head for years. Fine, Richard said, his voice terrifyingly quiet. If you think you are so capable, let us see how you survive without the safety net I provided. As of the second, you are cut off. You are no longer my daughter. I want you out of my will. I want you out of my house. Do not contact me. Do not come back when you fail. He paused, letting the words settle over the room like a shroud. You are dead to me, Marianne. He finished. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a physical weight. I could hear the antique clock ticking in the hallway. I could hear the shallow, panicked breathing of Mrs. Vanderbilt next to me. The guests were frozen, forks hovering halfway to mouths, eyes wide with the primal shock of witnessing a social execution. They looked at me with pity, waiting for the collapse. They expected the scream. They expected the tears, the begging, the desperate pleas for forgiveness. I disappointed them. I did not cry. I did not even blink. Instead, I felt a strange, cool wave of relief wash over me. It was done. He had said the words. He had publicly severed the tie, and in doing so, he had absolved me of any lingering moral obligation to protect him. He thought he was banishing me, but he was actually setting me free. I reached down to my ankle and picked up my purse. The movement was smooth, deliberate. Richard flinched slightly, perhaps expecting me to throw something, but I simply set the black leather bag on the table next to my wine glass. I took out my phone. The screen lit up, bright and jarring in the dim candlelight. I unlocked it with my face. I opened the Contacts app. I typed in Dad. His contact card appeared, featuring a photo of him smiling on his yacht, a photo I had taken myself 3 summers ago. I tapped the information icon. I scrolled down to the bottom of the screen. The room watched me in confused fascination. They did not understand what I was doing. Was I calling a cab? Was I calling the police, Marianne? My mother whispered, her voice trembling. What are you doing? I did not answer her. I kept my eyes on the screen. My thumb hovered over the red text that read, "Block this caller." I pressed it. A confirmation box popped up. You will not receive phone calls, messages, or FaceTime from people on the block list. I pressed block contact. The line turned gray. It was such a small digital action. It took less than 3 seconds. Yet, it felt like I had just detonated a bridge while standing on the other side. I placed the phone face down on the table. I looked up at Richard. He was staring at me, his brow furrowed, trying to decode my reaction. He was waiting for the pain to hit me. He wanted to see the wound. I heard you, Richard, I said. My voice was level, conversational, as if we were discussing the weather. And I accept your terms. Richard's mouth opened slightly, then closed. He looked like a man who had swung a sledgehammer at a glass wall, only to find out it was made of reinforced steel. You accept, he sputtered, his face reddening again. Do you understand what I just said? I just disowned you, I know. I said. I just wanted to make sure the feeling was mutual. I have blocked your number. You won't have to worry about me crawling back. A gasp rippled through the room. Arthur Sterling covered his mouth with his napkin. Lucas looked at me with genuine fear for the first time in his life. He realized that the sister who absorbed everything, the sister who fixed everything, had just left the building, leaving him alone in the cage with the tiger. I checked the time on my phone under the table. It was 9 o'clock exactly. Somewhere in the cloud, a server processed a command I had scheduled 2 hours ago. Hundreds of emails were currently landing in the inboxes of the SEC, the IRS, the partners at Northvale Strategies, and the editorial board of the Financial Times. Richard thought he had ended the story. He had no idea that the prologue had just finished. I wouldn't worry about me. Richard, I said, picking up my wine glass for a final toast. I would worry about your phone. It is about to get very busy. The sound started as a ripple. It was a vibration against the mahogany table, then a soft chime from a handbag, followed by the sharp ping of a text message notification. Within seconds, the dining room was filled with a discordant symphony of alerts. It was the sound of truth arriving at the speed of fiber optics. Arthur Sterling was the first to check his phone. He frowned, tapping the screen with a confused expression that rapidly darkened into disbelief. He wasn't the only one. I watched as the board members, the family friends, and even my mother reached for their devices, drawn in by the synchronized disruption. The email I had scheduled was thorough. It was not an emotional rant. It was a 300-page dossier containing PDF attachments of bank transfers, falsified invoices, and a particularly damning series of emails between Richard and his personal accountant. The subject line was simple notice of financial irregularities and unauthorized use of credentials, Holloway Holdings. Arthur looked up from his phone. His face had drained of color. Richard, Arthur said, his voice dangerously low. What is this? What is M.H. Consulting? Richard waved his hand dismissively, though I could see a bead of sweat tracking down his temple. Put the phones away, Richard barked, forcing a laugh that sounded like grinding gears. It is Christmas. Probably some spam or a glitch. You know how technology is? It is not spam, Arthur said, standing up. He held his phone out like a weapon. This is a transfer record. It shows $5 million moved from the waterfront project investors into a shell company registered in Marianne's name. But the signature on the incorporation papers, it is dated for a day Marianne was in London for a conference. I remember because I saw her there. The room went deadly silent. The guests looked from Arthur to Richard, and then, slowly, to me. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting on the tablecloth. I did not need to speak. The documents were speaking for me. The dossier laid out the scheme with mathematical precision. Richard had been bleeding his own companies dry to cover Lucas's catastrophic investment losses. To hide the theft, he had created a consulting firm using my credentials, my name, my social security number, my reputation, without my knowledge. He had framed me as the recipient of the stolen funds. If the scheme had collapsed on its own, I would have gone to prison for embezzlement while Richard played the grieving father who had been betrayed by his greedy daughter. You! Arthur turned to Richard, his voice shaking with fury. You were laundering money through her. You were setting her up to take the fall for this mess. It is complicated, Richard shouted, slamming his fist on the table. You don't understand the pressure I had to protect the legacy, Marianne. She is strong. She could have handled the heat if it came to that. But Lucas needed a win. Lucas dropped his fork. It clattered loudly against his china plate. He looked at the papers on his own phone, scrolling frantically. He saw the dates. He saw the amounts. He saw the reality of his success disintegrating in real time. Dad Lucas whispered, his voice cracking. The 20 million. The profit. It wasn't real. It was just stolen. It was necessary, Richard yelled, turning on his son. I did it for you. Do you think you are a genius? Do you think you made that money? I bought your success. Lucas. I bought it with her credit score and my connections. Lucas recoiled as if he had been slapped. For the first time in his life, the golden boy realized he wasn't the prince of the kingdom. He was just the pet. I watched the realization hit the guests. The illusion of the perfect Holloway family didn't just crack, it evaporated. Mrs. Vanderbilt stood up, clutching her purse tight against her chest. I suddenly don't feel well, she stammered, not making eye contact with anyone. Richard, Eleanor, I must go. Sit down, Catherine Richard commanded, his eyes wild. I am leaving. Richard, Arthur Sterling said, buttoning his jacket, and my lawyers will be contacting you in the morning. If my investment was funneled into a slush fund, I will see you in federal court. Chairs scraped against the floor. It was a mass exodus. People were muttering excuses about babysitters, early flights, and sudden headaches. They weren't just leaving a dinner party. They were fleeing a crime scene. Richard stood amidst the ruins of his dinner, his chest heaving. He looked at the retreating backs of his friends and associates. He tried to shout after them, but the words died in his throat. He turned to me. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. You! He hissed, pointing a trembling finger at me. You did this! You ungrateful! I met his gaze. I didn't smile. I didn't frown. I simply watched him. I was the analyst, and he was just a bad data point that had finally been corrected. The silence I offered him was heavier than any scream. He had lost the audience. He had lost the narrative. And now, as the front door closed behind the last guest, he realized he had lost the war. The heavy oak door had clicked shut, but the echo of the departure still hung in the dining room like smoke. My mother sat frozen in her chair, her hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles were white. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the breathless, terrifying vacuum that exists immediately after a structural collapse. Richard did not sit down. He paced the length of the Persian rug, his face a mask of frantic calculation. He was already trying to rewrite the history that had just occurred, attempting to spin the disaster into a manageable crisis. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, a gesture of rare nervousness. "It is fine," Richard muttered, talking more to himself than to us. "I will call Arthur in the morning. I will explain that it was a stress test, a simulation for the internal audit. He will understand. Arthur is a businessman. He knows how the game is played." He stopped pacing and turned to me. The fear in his eyes had been replaced by a desperate, delusional authority. He pointed a finger at me, shaking slightly. "And you," he said, his voice trembling with suppressed rage, "you will fix this. You will write a retraction. You will tell them you were confused. You will say you were off your medication. We will get Dr. Evans to sign an affidavit saying you are having a breakdown. We can spin this as a mental health crisis. People love a redemption story." I looked at him. I felt no surge of triumph. I felt no thrill of vengeance. I simply felt a profound, exhausting pity. He was a man standing in a burning building, trying to negotiate with the fire. "There is no retraction, Dad," I said. My voice was quiet, lacking any inflection of anger. "The metadata on those transfers matches your private server IP address. The authorization codes were sent from your phone. The timestamps correlate exactly with the times you were in meetings you claimed were private. There is no spin that can alter a digital footprint." "It was temporary," Richard shouted, his composure shattering. "It was a bridge loan. I was going to put it back as soon as Lucas's fund hit the first quarter projections. I was moving capital to protect the family." "You were stealing," I corrected him gently. "You were stealing from your investors to cover up the fact that your son lost $4 million in futures trading last year." The sound of my brother's name seemed to suck the air out of the room. Lucas, who had been staring at his phone in a catatonic daze, slowly looked up. His face was pale, his eyes wide and wet. "4 million, Lucas whispered. You told me. You told me the loss was tax deductible. You said the market turned against us, but we broke even." Richard wheeled around to face his son. "I handled it. I took care of it so you could keep your head up. I built a reputation for you. Lucas, I gave you a career. You gave me a lie." Lucas said. His voice was gaining strength, fueled by a dawning, horrified realization. "You told everyone I was a prodigy. You told me I was a prodigy, but you were just rigging the game, the waterfront deal, the tech IPO. Were any of them real?" "They were real enough," Richard snapped. "I did what had to be done to ensure the Holloway name meant something. You think you could have closed those deals on your own? You can barely read a balance sheet without getting a headache." The insult hung in the air, gross and undeniable. Richard had spent 30 years propping Lucas up, only to tear him down in a single second of panic. Lucas stood up. He looked at his father, and for the first time, I saw the adoration vanish from his eyes. It was replaced by a hollow, sickening clarity. He realized he was not the heir apparent. He was the prop. He was the expensive suit Richard wore to look successful. "I am not the genius," Lucas said, his voice breaking. "And you are not the Titan. We are just frauds. I am the only reason you are not working at a gas station." Richard screamed, his veins bulging in his neck. "I carried you. I carried all of you. And this is the thanks I get. Betrayal from my own blood." He looked at my mother, seeking an ally. "Eleanor, tell them what I have sacrificed." My mother looked up. She looked at her husband, then at her son, and finally at me. She saw the wreckage of her family dinner, the shattered crystal of her perfect life. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She simply closed her eyes and turned her head away. Richard stood alone in the center of the room. The power he had wielded for decades, the power to define our reality, to assign our worth, to control our narratives, had evaporated. He wasn't a patriarch anymore. He was just an old man who had committed a federal crime, screaming at a room full of people who finally saw him for what he was. I picked up my purse. I did not slam it onto my shoulder. I did not storm out. I moved with the efficiency of someone who had finished a job. "The authorities have the files," I said, looking at Richard one last time. "I suggest you call a lawyer instead of Arthur. You are going to need one who specializes in white-collar defense. Marianne." Richard's voice faltered. It lost its edge. It sounded almost like a plea. Wait. I did not wait. The hierarchy was gone. The spell was broken. I turned my back on the table, on the cold food, and on the ruins of the Holloway dynasty. I walked out of the dining room, and the heavy velvet drapes swallowed the sound of my father's shouting. The chaos I had unleashed was raging just a few yards behind me, but as I stepped into the foyer, the house felt strangely tomb-like. The marble floors reflected the twinkling lights of the 12-foot Christmas tree that stood in the center of the entryway, a perfect symmetrical monument to a joy that did not exist in this home. I took my coat from the closet myself. Usually, there would have been a staff member there to assist, or my mother hovering nervously to make sure I had a scarf. But tonight, the house was paralyzed. I buttoned my wool coat, my fingers moving with a steady, rhythmic calm. I looked at myself in the gilded mirror by the door. I expected to see a different woman looking back, someone scarred or exhilarated by the carnage. Instead, I just saw Marianne. I saw the same face I had looked at every morning for 34 years, only the tension that usually tightened the corners of my eyes was gone. I opened the heavy front door and stepped out into the night. The cold hit me instantly. It was a sharp, biting chill, probably 20 degrees or lower, but it felt cleansing. The air smelled of wood smoke and ice, a stark contrast to the suffocating scent of roasting meat and expensive perfume I had just left behind. I walked down the stone steps, my heels clicking softly on the path that had been cleared of snow. No one came after me. There were no footsteps rushing to the door, no voice calling my name to beg me to reconsider. In the movies, this is the part where the protagonist stops and looks back at the lighted window, shedding a single tear for what was lost. I did not look back. I did not stop. I realized with a sudden, jolting clarity that I was not waiting for them to chase me because I no longer cared if they caught up. For decades, the threat of being cut off had been the monster under my bed. It was the weapon Richard used to keep me in line, the fear that I would be unmoored, drifting in the world without the anchor of the Holloway name. But standing there in the driveway, under the vast indifference of the winter sky, I understood the truth. The anchor had not been holding me steady. It had been dragging me down. Being disowned was not a death sentence. It was an amputation of a gangrenous limb. It hurt, yes, but it was the pain of healing. I reached my car, a sensible sedan I had bought with my own bonus check 3 years ago. It sat alone in the driveway, covered in a thin layer of fresh snow. I brushed the powder off the door handle. I did not feel a surge of victory. Tearing down my father's empire did not give me a rush of dopamine or a sense of sadistic pleasure. It just felt correct. It felt like balancing a ledger that had been in the red for too long. I had simply returned the energy they had given me. They gave me transactional love, so I gave them transactional justice. They gave me silence, so I gave them the truth. I sat in the driver's seat and closed the door, sealing out the wind. The silence inside the car was absolute. It was a private, holy space. I looked at the dashboard clock. It was 9:15. The night was still young. Merry Christmas, Marianne. I whispered to the empty car. My voice sounded strong. It sounded like it belonged to me. I realized then that freedom does not require an audience. It does not need applause or validation or a witness to make it real. It just requires the decision to turn the key in the ignition and drive away from the only life you have ever known. I started the engine. The heater hummed to life. I put the car in gear and drove down the long, winding driveway, leaving the lights of the Holloway estate fading in my rearview mirror until they were nothing more than distant, blurring stars I was not going home. I was already there. I pulled into a 24-hour diner about 30 miles outside of Redwood Falls. The fluorescent lights buzzed with a low electric hum that felt more comforting than the crystal chandeliers I had left behind. I sat in a vinyl booth that was cracked along the seam, ordering a black coffee from a waitress who looked like she had been working since yesterday morning. "You want pie with that, honey?" she asked, pencil hovering over her pad. "You look like you had a long night." I looked at my reflection in the dark window. I didn't look tired. I looked awake. "No pie," I said, offering her a genuine smile. "Just the coffee. And, actually, make it to go. I have a long drive ahead of me." She nodded and walked away. I placed my phone on the table. It was the last tether. I opened the settings menu. My thumb hovered over the contact list. There they were, arranged alphabetically. The people who had defined my existence for 3 decades. Dad, Mom, Lucas. They were just names now. They were just data bytes taking up storage space that I needed for better things. I tapped edit. I selected Lucas. I hit delete contact. The phone asked me to confirm. I didn't hesitate. Gone. I selected mother. I thought about her silence at the table, her complicity in my erasure. I hit delete contact. Gone. Then I reached the entry for Dad. A notification banner slid down from the top of the screen. It was a voicemail transcript from a blocked number. My carrier sometimes let them through as a courtesy. The preview text scrolled across the top. Marianne pickup. "We can negotiate. Don't do this to the family. Negotiate." Even now, facing the ruin of his reputation, he thought this was a business deal. He thought he could buy my silence with a new contract, a new promise, a new lie. He thought I was holding out for a better offer. He simply could not conceive of a world where I did not want what he had to give. I did not tap the notification. I did not listen to the sound of his voice, desperate and cracking. I didn't need to hear it. That voice had been the soundtrack of my insecurity for too long. I swiped the notification away to the left. Delete. I deleted his contact card. I deleted the call history. I emptied the deleted items folder. The waitress returned with a paper cup. "Here you go," she said. "That will be $3.50. I handed her a $5 bill. "Keep the change," I said. "Thanks," she said, looking at me curiously. Heading home for Christmas, I stood up and buttoned my coat. "No," I said, and the word tasted like fresh air. I am heading somewhere new. I walked out of the diner and into the parking lot. The snow had stopped falling. The sky was clear, a vast expanse of black ink dotted with stars that didn't care about stock prices or family legacies or the hollow expectations of bitter old men. I got into my car and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. It sat there, silent and dark. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for it to ring. I wasn't waiting for permission to speak. I wasn't waiting to be told I was good enough. I started the engine. The radio came on, playing a soft jazz tune. I didn't turn it off. I checked my mirrors, shifted into drive, and pulled onto the highway. The road ahead was dark, unlit, and completely unknown. I didn't know where I would be when the sun came up, and I didn't care. The destination didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was that for the first time in 34 years, the person behind the wheel was me. I pressed the accelerator and drove into the quiet, beautiful, dark. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'm curious, where in the world are you guys listening from right now? Drop a comment down below and let me know. I'd love to see how far our community reaches. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, please hit that subscribe button for Victoria Revenge Stories, like this video, and smash that hype button to help us get these stories out to even more people.